Doctor, Ravin adjusted the collar of his field uniform, his breath coming in short. Measured exhales as he took in the eerie stillness around him. His ship had landed on the outskirts of Eagle's Rest, a human settlement marked as small but thriving in the planetary survey reports. The air smelled of organic decay, faintly sweet, mingling with something metallic, perhaps traces of processed iron from human structures. The town's infrastructure seemed intact, power lines humming faintly, street lamps still flickering from the night before. And yet, something was wrong. The settlement was silent, too silent. He stepped cautiously down a dirt path leading toward the cluster of human dwellings. The ground crunched beneath his boots, but there were no voices, no sounds of movement, no distant murmur of conversation. The wind swept through the town, carrying only the rustle of leaves and the creaking of an old wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Eagle's Rest." Ravin approached the first dwelling, its structure primitive by Veldar standards. Wooden walls, glass windows, a slanted roof. Through the transparent barrier, his 4 eyes took in the inside. Not just here, every house, every street, every vehicle abandoned mid-use. A coffee cup sat on the hood of a parked car, its surface still faintly steaming, as if its owner had set it down just before succumbing to whatever this was. Panic rose in his chest. His species had seen this before the Great Collapse, a biological event that had impacted entire sectors of Veldar history, rendering thousands unresponsive. Could this be a variant? Had humanity succumbed to a silent, unknown affliction? His communicator pulsed in his ear. "Dr. Ravin, report." He swallowed hard before responding. "This is Dr. Ravin, a field researcher for the Veldar Xenological Initiative. I have arrived at the designated human settlement." He hesitated, scanning the lifeless streets, the unmoving figures. His scales darkened to a troubled shade of blue. "I believe I have discovered a mass extinction event in progress." Silence on the other end, then a crackle of static. "Clarify. The entire settlement has been affected. I have documented dozens, no, hundreds of cases. Human subjects are unresponsive, exhibiting signs of total motor failure. Preliminary observation suggests immediate cessation of activity occurred mid-task. Many appear to have collapsed in the middle of daily functions. Evidence suggests no struggle. Whatever this is, it struck suddenly, without warning. I recommend immediate dispatch of a medical crisis team." A pause. "Confirmed. Medical team assembling. Maintain observation. But do not make direct contact with the afflicted." Ravin moved deeper into the town, scanning every doorway, every shadowed alley. No movement, no signs of life. Then a sound. A deep, guttural mechanical rumble broke through the silence, sending a shockwave of tension through Ravin's body. He spun around, every muscle tensed, his hands hovering near his emergency beacon. Down the road, a large vehicle rolled toward him, its headlights cut through the gray dawn, illuminating the empty street. A municipal transport? An automated patrol? No, something more primitive. The shape of it matched a ground transport described in human documents. A truck. It slowed as it approached, its engine sputtering softly before coming to a stop mere feet away. The driver's side door opened with a groan, and a human stepped out. Ravin's breath caught in his throat. A conscious human. The figure stretched, cracked its neck, and then adjusted the brim of what appeared to be a hat. His clothing was distinct, thicker than the others Ravin had seen, layered for warmth. A uniform of some sort. His skin was lined with age, his movements deliberate. The human yawned. Then, he looked directly at Ravin and spoke. "Morning, friend. You look a little lost." Raven's mind fractured into 1,000 competing thoughts. This man was awake. The entire settlement had fallen into unconsciousness. Yet here stood one, standing, breathing, utterly unaffected. "I am Dr. Ravin of the Veldar Xenological Initiative," he forced out, his voice steadier than he felt. "I must warn you, there is a problem occurring in your settlement." The human's expression shifted, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What now?" "A crisis. Your people," Ravin gestured around them. "They have all succumbed to total motor failure. I have observed it across every dwelling. Whatever is afflicting them is widespread. I fear you may be the only one left." The human squinted at him. Then, to Ravin's absolute shock, he grinned. "Son, you're telling me you're worried 'cause everyone's asleep?" The word hit Ravin like a physical force. "Asleep?" "Yeah," the man chuckled. "That's kind of what people do at night. Ravin stared, his mind reeling, gears shifting violently as he processed the impossible truth. The realization was so jarring, so utterly outside the bounds of reason that Ravin's knees nearly buckled beneath him. His scales flickered between shades of stunned gold and deep, embarrassed violet. You mean to tell me this is normal? The man gave a slow nod. Yep, been doing it since the dawn of time. I just got up myself. Ravin's communicator buzzed again. Urgent. Doctor, Ravin. Confirm. Have the afflicted regained function? He hesitated, his mind still reeling from the revelation. Then, from behind the windows of a nearby house, he saw it, movement. A human stretched, rubbed their face, and then reached for a nearby beverage container. Another light flickered on in the distance. A door creaked open. A voice called out. The town was waking up. Ravin slowly exhaled. Disregard the previous report, he murmured into his communicator, voice tight. The situation has evolved. Ravin stood frozen, his mind still struggling to reconcile the impossible. The entire town, the entire species, they all just lost consciousness every night? And then woke up, as if nothing had happened. No biological repercussions? No neural degradation? No permanent system failure? The human Cameron Hayes, as his uniform badge read, was watching him with a mixture of amusement and mild concern. He took a slow sip from a metal thermos, steam curling from its lid, before letting out a satisfied sigh. You good there, Doc? You look like someone just told you the sun ain't real. Ravin blinked rapidly, trying to stabilize his racing thoughts. He could hear the town coming alive around him, doors creaking open, muffled voices carrying through the crisp morning air, and the distant bark of a canine. They were all waking up. I don't understand, he finally managed, his voice uneven. You mean to tell me that this state of unconsciousness is a daily occurrence? Hayes arched a brow. That's one way to put it. Round here, we just call it bedtime. But that's impossible, Ravin said, shaking his head. A species that willingly shuts down its cognitive functions for hours at a time? Hayes let out a short laugh. Well, Doc, somehow we've managed just fine. Ravin couldn't respond. He was already pulling up data on his communicator, his fingers moving over the interface. His research covered every major aspect of human biology: metabolism, neural pathways, cardiovascular endurance, thermal regulation, even cellular regeneration, but somehow, this one fundamental detail had never been recorded. How did we miss this? He muttered, mostly to himself. Miss what? That your entire species loses consciousness every cycle. This should be in every medical report, every behavioral analysis. He stopped, his breath catching as realization struck. His research hadn't missed it. The data had been incomplete, redacted, not by accident, on purpose. His communicator pulsed with an incoming transmission. Dr. Ravin, report. What is happening? He hesitated, glancing at Hayes, who was watching him with the lazy patience of someone who'd already had a full night's rest. Slowly, deliberately, Ravin pressed the transmit button. Preliminary assessment was incorrect, he said, forcing his voice into its usual professional calm. This is not an extinction event. The human population is experiencing a cyclical period of neural deactivation known as sleep. A long silence on the other end. Ravin exhaled sharply. They sleep, every day, for hours at a time, intentionally, and then, the unmistakable edge of barely contained disbelief. Dr. Ravin, are you telling us that an entire sentient species willingly enters a state of total biological vulnerability at regular intervals? Yes. And this is normal? Yes. Another long pause. What the hell? Hayes let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head. Yeah, that about sums it up. Ravin cut the transmission. His mind was already spiraling deeper into the implications. A civilization that deliberately rendered itself defenseless? That shut down for nearly a third of its existence? The sheer improbability of it defied every known principle of survival. But humans had survived. More than that. They had thrived. Doc, Hayes said, pulling him out of his thoughts. You look like you're about to have an aneurysm. You want to sit down? Ravin ignored him, his hands twitching as they hovered over his research module. This contradicts everything we know about advanced species progression. How does your society function with such a fundamental inefficiency? Hayes took another sip of his coffee. Who says it's inefficient? Are you serious? Ravin gestured wildly around them. Your civilization loses a third of its productivity to unconsciousness. That's a biological defect. Hayes smirked. Or maybe it's our biggest strength. Raven's frustration spiked. Explain. Hayes scratched his jaw, eyes flicking toward the sky as if searching for the right words. All right, let me put it this way. You ever go without sleep for a long time? Ravin hesitated. Veldar do not require sleep. Hayes gave him a long, considering look. Then he whistled low. Well, that explains a lot. Explains what? Why do you look like you got a mile-long stick up your ass? Ravin's scales flickered into an irritated shade of violet. I do not... Look, Doc, here's the thing. Hayes interrupted, setting his thermos down on the truck's hood. You think sleep is a waste of time. I get it. If you're only looking at raw productivity, sure, I can see why it looks dumb as hell. But sleep ain't just about shutting down. He tapped the side of his head. It's about resetting. It's how our bodies heal, how our brains process information, how we... He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Wait, if your people don't sleep, do you even dream? Ravin's brow furrowed. Dream? You don't know what a dream is? Ravin opened his mouth and closed it. There was no reference to that term in any of his databases. I am unfamiliar. Hayes let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disbelief. Ravin bristled. What? Hayes turned to him fully, arms crossed over his chest. Doc, if you don't dream, then how the hell do you come up with new ideas? The question hit harder than it should have. Ravin took a step back, something uneasy curling in his chest. What do you mean? I mean, Hayes said, some of the biggest discoveries in human history, they came from dreams. All of them started in someone's head while they were asleep. Ravin felt his throat go dry. That's impossible. Hayes shrugged. Well, maybe. But last I checked, we're the ones flying across the stars. And we did it on 8 hours of shut-eye a night. Raven's mind reeled. He had come here expecting to document a species barely scraping by, primitive in their methods, inefficient in their ways. Instead, he had found something else entirely. Humans weren't weak because they slept. They were strong because they did. And if that was true, if dreams were truly the foundation of their progress, then what did that mean for his own people? A single, horrifying thought surfaced. What if Veldar hadn't evolved beyond sleep? Ravin's stomach turned. He suddenly, desperately needed more data. Hayes slapped him on the shoulder. Come on, Doc. Let's get you a cup of coffee. You look like you need it. Ravin barely registered the words, his mind already sprinting toward the inevitable conclusion. His people weren't just running on efficiency. They were running on borrowed time. Ravin sat in the corner booth of the Eagle's Rest Diner, his fingers absently tapping against the side of his cup. He had barely touched the dark liquid inside. Coffee, as Camden had called it, but the steam curling from the surface carried a scent he couldn't quite describe, much like everything else about this planet. The morning rush had settled, leaving only a handful of locals scattered throughout the diner. A woman near the counter sipped her coffee while flipping through a newspaper. An older man sat by the window, methodically buttering a slice of toast. Every now and then, the bell above the door chimed as another human walked in, stretching, yawning, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Ravin watched them, fascinated. They had willingly allowed themselves to become unconscious just hours ago, and yet here they were, fully functional, completely unfazed by their own biological vulnerability. He had spent the last several minutes in near-silent disbelief, his mind spiraling into possibilities, searching for some rational explanation as to why a civilization built on such an inherent weakness hadn't collapsed under its own inefficiency. Camden slid into the booth across from him, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand and a plate of something brown and fried in the other. He shoved the plate toward Ravin. Try this. Ravin eyed the food suspiciously. What is it? Bacon, he said. I have read about bacon, Ravin replied. Camden smirked. Then you know how lucky you are right now. Ravin hesitated, then picked up a piece between 2 fingers, examining its texture. It was greasy and crispy. He took a cautious bite. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, the sheer intensity of flavor, the salt, the fat, the crunch was overwhelming. His senses went into overdrive, his body momentarily unsure how to process what was happening. His scales flickered violently between shades of gold and deep crimson as his neural pathways struggled to keep up. Camden barked out a laugh. I'll take that as a yes. Ravin forced himself to swallow, blinking rapidly. This is absurdly complex. You should try it with eggs. Camden is excited. Ravin inhaled sharply, shaking his head. No, focus. I need answers. Camden grinned around his coffee. Ravin leaned forward, his voice dropping into something almost conspiratorial. Your species sleeps. This is a fact. It is also highly illogical. Camden rolled his eyes. Back to this again? Yes, because it defies all known models of biological efficiency. A species that voluntarily renders itself immobile for hours at a time should not have survived long enough to develop a complex society, much less interstellar travel. And yet, Ravin gestured around them, his frustration mounting. Here you are. Camden chewed a piece of bacon thoughtfully. Maybe survival ain't just about staying awake. Ravin exhaled through his nose, his fingers pressing into the tabletop. Then explain it to me. Because my people, we do not sleep. We function continuously. We have never needed this process you rely on. Camden tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting. You sure about that? The question made Ravin pause. Something about Cam's tone unsettled him. What are you implying? Camden set his coffee down. Look, Doc, I've met a lot of people in my life. Soldiers, engineers, doctors, pilots. I've seen them run on nothing but adrenaline and stubbornness for days. But you know what always happens? Ravin didn't answer. They crash. Cam's fingers drummed lightly against the ceramic rim of his cup. They have to. Doesn't matter how tough you are, or how much you try to fight it. You push too long without rest. And eventually, your body shuts you down. Ravin bristled. That is not how Veldar physiology works. Uh-huh. Camden took another sip, then leaned forward. Then tell me this. If your people never need sleep, why do you all keep passing out? Raven's body went rigid. The words hit harder than they should have. He opened his mouth to refute them, to insist that the growing reports of unexplained neural failures among the Veldar were anomalies, nothing more. But the excuse died before it could leave his throat. Because deep down, in the part of his mind that he had trained to ignore for the sake of science, he knew. Something was wrong with his people. And it had been getting worse. His research logs had noted the increasing cases of sudden, unexplained unconsciousness among Veldar scientists, workers, and even high-ranking officials. At first, they were dismissed as isolated incidents. Then they became a pattern. Entire sectors of their workforce had begun experiencing sporadic episodes of total, cognitive shutdown, short bursts of unconsciousness that no medical explanation could fully account for. But this was different. Because now, looking at the humans in front of him, watching how they woke up from their unconscious state, refreshed, functioning, completely fine, a terrible possibility took shape in his mind. What if his people weren't experiencing some new condition? What if it wasn't a disease? What if it was simply something they had forgotten how to do? The thought made his stomach twist. Camden studied him for a long moment as if reading the struggle in his expression. Then he leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. You ever hear the phrase running on fumes? Ravin shook his head, still reeling. It means you're still moving, but you got nothing left in the tank. You keep pushing, keep running on empty, and eventually, you just stop. Ravin swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Are you saying my people are running on empty? Camden met his gaze head on. I'm saying, he said, that if y'all don't figure this out soon, you're gonna have difficulty. Ravin exhaled shakily. His mind was spinning, colliding with itself, trying to reconcile centuries of belief with the truth staring him in the face. His people had built a civilization that never stopped. But maybe that had been the biggest mistake of all. Before he could say anything else, his communicator blared with a priority transmission. Dr. Ravin, urgent update from the homeworld. His heart clenched. He tapped the receiver. Go ahead. The voice on the other end was tight, panicked. The Central Research District has just experienced a widespread neural blackout. Hundreds of Veldar workers collapsed simultaneously. The High Council is calling for immediate intervention. Ravin ran cold. Cam's expression darkened. Let me guess. Your people just took their first nap? Ravin's throat went dry. No, he whispered. They're not waking up. Silence hung heavy between them. Ravin's hands clenched around the edge of the table, his breathing uneven. His mind fought against the weight of the words that had just been transmitted. Hundreds of Veldar collapsing at once, a mass event unfolding in real time. Cam's voice cut through the haze. They're not waking up? Ravin swallowed hard, his throat dry. No. The diner around them was still, but his pulse pounded in his ears. He barely registered the scent of coffee, the distant clatter of dishes, the casual murmur of human conversation. The world around him remained blissfully unchanged, unaware of the catastrophe unraveling light years away. Cam's expression turned grim. All right? Doc, what's your plan? Ravin's mind searched for one, but for the first time in his life, there was no protocol for this. His people had never slept, not in living memory. Their technology had erased the need. And now, it was failing. His hands moved automatically, pulling up his communicator, his fingers trembling as he navigated to the live transmission from Veldar's homeworld. The feed flickered, revealing a scene of chaos. The Central Research District, one of the most advanced hubs of Veldar civilization, was in crisis. Bodies lay sprawled across laboratory floors, inside government offices, in the streets, their screens still glowing with half-finished calculations. Others were slumped over consoles, their fingers frozen in place, and none of them were moving. Dr. Ravin. The voice on the other end belonged to Director Halvrin, one of the most respected minds on Veldar. But his tone now was frantic, shaken in a way Ravin had never heard before. We need immediate action. The affected are unresponsive. No medical intervention is working. Their neural activity is unstable. This is escalating, Halvrin continued, his voice clipped with urgency. This isn't just the research district. We're getting reports from multiple sectors. Industrial, medical, government. This phenomenon is spreading. Ravin's stomach twisted. He knew what this was. The suppression fields, the ancient, forgotten technology that had kept their civilization awake, were failing. Not just in isolated incidents anymore, but everywhere. Veldar wasn't experiencing a crisis. His communicator crackled again. Another voice joined the channel, sharp, authoritative, and terrified. Dr. Ravin, the High Council demands an immediate solution. If this continues, our infrastructure will collapse. We will lose planetary control. He could hear the edge of desperation behind the official tone. Veldar had never stopped before. Their cities ran without pause. Their people worked in endless cycles, always efficient, always moving. There were no shifts, no rest periods, no contingency plan for what happened when everything just stopped. Camden watched him carefully. You hearing what I'm hearing? Ravin's hands trembled as he closed his communicator, staring blankly at the tabletop. If we don't act fast, Veldar civilization will affect within a cycle. Camden exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Well? Something inside Ravin snapped. We need to get to your research facilities, now. Camden didn't waste time with questions. He grabbed his key, tossed some cash onto the table, and led the way out the door. The crisp morning air did nothing to clear Ravin's thoughts as they climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life beneath them. As Camden pulled onto the road, his eyes flicked toward Ravin. All right, genius. What's the move? Ravin's mind raced. He needed data, real human sleep data. How did humans enter sleep? How did they wake up? What neural triggers were involved? He had spent decades studying human biology, and yet this fundamental process had been overlooked, dismissed as trivial. It wasn't trivial. It was everything. We need to simulate human sleep patterns, he said, his voice tight with urgency. If we can map the neurological transition points, if we can find a way to trigger wakefulness in Veldar minds, we might be able to stabilize them. Camden made a sharp turn, his grip firm on the wheel. And how do we do that? Ravin hesitated. The answer was painfully obvious. We need to make a Veldar sleep. Camden blinked. You mean, like, you? The words hit harder than they should have. Ravin clenched his jaw. His people had never slept. But if they really were suffering from an unnatural suppression, if their bodies still remembered how to sleep, buried somewhere deep in their biology, then there was one way to find out. He took a shaky breath. Yes, me. Camden let out a low whistle. Well, Doc, this is either going to be a breakthrough or a real bad time for you. Ravin swallowed. Let's hope it's the first. The research lab wasn't far. Camden pulled the truck up to the facility, a modest building lined with computers and monitoring equipment. Inside, the place smelled of old books and coffee, screens flickering with graphs and brain scans. Ravin moved on autopilot, setting up the monitoring station and aligning the neural interface, his hands moving faster than his thoughts. His heart pounded in his chest. But they had no time for hesitation. Camden stood beside him, arms crossed. "All right, how does this work?" Ravin sat in the reclined medical chair, adjusting the neural nodes against his temple. He swallowed hard. "I don't know." Camden arched a brow. "That's real reassuring." Ravin exhaled sharply. "Just monitor the readings. If this works, if Veldar physiology is still capable of natural sleep, then I should," he hesitated, "lose consciousness." Cam's smirk faded. "And if it doesn't work?" Ravin didn't answer. Camden sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, Doc, let's get this over with." Ravin reached for the sedative. His hands shook. Cam's voice softened. "Hey." Ravin looked up. "You got this." The words shouldn't have meant anything. They were simple. But something in the way Camden said them, something steady, something human, settled the storm raging in Ravin's mind. He nodded and pressed the injector. The world faded. Darkness took him. At first, there was nothing. Just an absence of sound, of light, of time itself. Then something shifted. A flicker, a feeling. Something deep, something ancient, something buried beneath centuries of artificial wakefulness. His body remembered. And for the first time in his existence, Dr. Ravin dreamed. His mind exploded with color, with memory, with something raw and unfiltered. He saw flashes of places he had never been, thoughts colliding with each other in chaotic, beautiful patterns. His subconscious unfolded, a tapestry of ideas and emotions and things that had been suppressed for generations. The alarm blared. Raven's eyes snapped open. His lungs gasped for air. His entire body convulsed, scales flickering wildly, his limbs shaking as if he had been rebooted from the inside out. Cam's voice was sharp, urgent. "Ravin! Talk to me!" Ravin stared at the ceiling, his heart hammering. His neurons are alive with something new and old at the same time. He turned to Cam, his voice hoarse, shaken. "I know how to wake them up." Ravin sat up too fast, his body rebelling against him. His vision swam. His limbs trembled. But his mind was alive. It was clear in a way he had never experienced before. Colors seemed sharper, thoughts moved effortlessly, and connections formed as if they had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. He felt awake in a way he never had before. Camden was gripping his shoulders, steadying him. "Jesus." "Doc, you were out cold for nearly an hour. Thought I was going to have to slap you awake." Ravin barely registered the words. His fingers dug into the fabric of the medical chair, his breathing uneven. He had seen things, felt things. He had dreamed, and now he understood. He looked at Cam, his 4 eyes sharp with certainty. "We need to get this to Veldar. Now." Camden didn't hesitate. "Then let's move." The lab burst into motion, equipment being shut down, files being transferred, and coordinates locked in. Ravin was already transmitting the data, the brainwave frequencies, the neural rhythms that had finally allowed him to sleep. The key to waking his people was in this data, in replicating the natural process of human sleep. His communicator pulsed with an incoming priority transmission. The High Council. His hands were still shaking as he answered. "Dr. Ravin." The voice on the other end was laced with barely contained desperation. "The situation is escalating. Over half of the central population sectors have fallen unconscious. The affected remain unresponsive. No medical intervention has worked, if we do not find a solution soon." "I have the solution," Ravin cut in. His voice was steady, filled with a certainty he hadn't felt before. "Transmit these neural synchronization frequencies across all medical stations. Initiate a controlled induction of sleep phases. Their bodies are trying to reset. They need the final trigger to complete the process. We can guide them through it." A pause. Then, "Are you certain?" Raven's eyes met Cam's. The human nodded. "Yes," Ravin said. "I'm certain." The transmission ended. Now, all they could do was wait. Every screen in the lab was tuned to the Veldar homeworld, to live feeds from the medical centers. The images were the same, rows upon rows of Veldar lying motionless, their scales dull, their bodies unresponsive. Then a shift. One of them twitched. A gasp. One by one, the fallen stirred, their fingers flexing, their eyes blinking open for the first time in hours. Their scales flickered with confused shades of blue and gold, as if their bodies didn't fully comprehend what had just happened to them. One of them spoke. "I saw something." The feed erupted in movement. Medical teams rushed in, voices filled with relief and disbelief. More Veldar woke, their neural activity stabilizing. The crisis was ending. And yet, something far greater had begun. Because the first thing they spoke of wasn't fear, it was dreams. The transmissions came flooding in, hundreds, thousands. Veldar waking from their first natural sleep in generations, their minds filled with something they had never known before. Visions, memories that weren't real but felt alive. Ravin swallowed hard, his chest tight. He had expected their survival. But this? This was something else entirely. His communicator crackled again. It was Director Halvrin. "Dr. Ravin." His voice was unsteady, raw with emotion. "The High Council wishes to express their—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Their gratitude. You have done something we thought impossible. You have returned something we had lost." Ravin exhaled slowly. He had saved them, but they had also been given something far greater than just survival. Camden clapped him on the back. "You did it, Doc." Ravin turned to him, feeling something profoundly different settle in his chest. His mind was still reeling from the experience, from the sheer depth of what had happened to him. But more than that, he felt lighter. For the first time in his life, he felt whole. Camden smirked. "So, you ready to admit that sleep ain't so bad?" Ravin let out a breath that felt like the end of a lifelong burden. His scales shifted into something new, something calm, something he had never known before but now understood completely. "You were right," he admitted quietly. "Sleep is not a weakness." Camden grinned. "Damn right. It ain't." Outside the lab, the Earth sky stretched wide, the horizon burning with the colors of an approaching night, a night Ravin would no longer fear. He turned his gaze toward the stars, toward the world he had left behind. His people had survived, but now, for the first time in history, they would truly live.